The story of Jeff Bezos, the man behind Amazon and Blue Origin and more. When Jeff Bezos walked into a Manhattan office building in early 1994, he was a senior vice president at D.E. Shaw, one of Wall Street's most sophisticated quantitative hedge funds. At 30 years old, he had already achieved what most would consider extraordinary success. He was earning a high six-figure salary, managing complex trading algorithms, and working directly with David Shaw, one of the most brilliant minds in finance. His future at the firm seemed limitless. David Shaw himself had indicated that Bezos was on track for partnership and potentially even succession. But Bezos had stumbled upon something that wouldn't let him sleep at night. A single statistic kept running through his mind. Web usage was growing at 2,300% per year. Not 23%, not 230%, but 2,300% annually. He had never seen any technology adoption curve that looked anything like this. The number seemed almost impossible, yet he had verified it multiple times. This wasn't just growth, it was an explosion. In that spring meeting with David Shaw, Bezos presented an idea. He wanted to start an online bookstore. Shaw listened carefully, as he always did. He was known for his patience and analytical rigor. After Bezos finished his pitch, Shaw did something unexpected. He asked Bezos to walk with him through Central Park. For 2 hours, they discussed the idea as they wandered through the park. Shaw acknowledged the opportunity was real and significant. The growth numbers were undeniable. But he also laid out a framework that would haunt Bezos for weeks. This would be a great idea for someone who didn't already have a great job, Shaw said. For someone like Bezos, who had already climbed so high and had so much to lose, was it worth the risk? Bezos went home that night and couldn't stop thinking. He created what he would later call a regret minimization framework. He projected himself forward to age 80 and asked a simple question. Would he regret leaving Wall Street and trying this crazy internet startup idea? The answer was clearly no. Even if the company failed completely, he wouldn't regret having tried. But would he regret not trying, watching the internet revolution happen from the sidelines while he stayed in his comfortable job? That answer was equally clear. He would regret it enormously. The regret of inaction would be far greater than the regret of failure. 2 months later, Bezos quit his job at D.E. Shaw. His boss was disappointed but understanding. His colleagues thought he was insane. His parents were worried but supportive. His wife Mackenzie, whom he had met at D.E. Shaw, agreed to join him on this adventure. They packed their belongings into a Chevy Blazer and drove west toward Seattle. Bezos had chosen Seattle for specific reasons. It had a strong tech talent pool thanks to Microsoft, it was close to a major book distribution warehouse in Oregon, and it had a relatively small population, which meant he would have to collect sales tax in fewer states initially. But as Mackenzie drove, Bezos sat in the passenger seat with a laptop, typing out the business plan for what he was tentatively calling Cadabra, as in abracadabra. His lawyer later told him it sounded too much like cadaver, so he would change it. He was searching for a name that conveyed something powerful and vast. He eventually landed on Amazon, after the world's largest river. He wanted to build the world's largest bookstore, a store that could offer every book in print to every person on Earth. It was an audacious vision for someone driving across the country with everything he owned in the back of a truck. This moment captures everything about what made Jeff Bezos different. He wasn't the most brilliant technologist of his generation. He wasn't the most charismatic salesman. He wasn't even the most obvious entrepreneur. But he had something rare and valuable. He had the ability to see mathematical patterns that others missed and the courage to bet his entire career on those patterns. He combined quantitative rigor with almost reckless boldness. He could project decades into the future while simultaneously focusing on the immediate next step. And most critically, he had an abnormally high tolerance for risk and public failure. The story of how Bezos built Amazon from that Chevy Blazer into one of the most powerful companies in human history is not a story of steady, linear growth. It's a story of someone who saw the future with unusual clarity, who was willing to be misunderstood for years at a time, who made massive bets that seemed insane to almost everyone around him, and who built a culture so intensely focused on the long term that it drove many people away while attracting others who thrived in that environment. To understand why Bezos could do what he did, we need to go back to the beginning. Jeffrey Preston Jorgensen was born on January 12, 1964, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. His mother, Jacqueline Jies Jorgensen, was just 17 years old. His biological father, Ted Jorgensen, was 18, a circus performer and unicyclist. They had married young, too young, and the marriage was already fracturing when Jeff was born. Within 2 years, it would be over. Ted would largely disappear from Jeff's life, not reconnecting until decades later after Jeff had become famous. To understand Jeff Bezos, we must first understand the America he was born into in 1964, because it was a nation on the cusp of extraordinary transformation. This was the heart of the 1960s, a decade that would reshape American society, culture, technology, and business in ways that would directly influence Jeff's future path. The economic context of 1964 was one of unprecedented prosperity. The post-World War II boom was in full swing. Gross domestic product had grown every year since 1961. Unemployment was below 6% and falling. The middle class was expanding rapidly. Technology was advancing at a pace that seemed miraculous to those living through it. The space race was in full force. President Kennedy had committed America to landing on the moon by the end of the decade. Color television had just become commercially viable. Computers existed, but they were massive room-filling machines owned only by governments, universities, and the largest corporations. The idea of a personal computer was pure science fiction. But beneath this surface stability, forces were gathering that would transform everything. The transistor had been invented in 1947. The integrated circuit in 1958. Moore's law had just been articulated in 1965. When Jeff was 4 years old, Jacqueline married Miguel Bezos, a Cuban immigrant who had come to America at age 15 as part of Operation Peter Pan, a program that brought thousands of unaccompanied Cuban children to the United States after Castro's revolution. Miguel's story was remarkable in its own right. He had arrived in America speaking no English, with nothing but the clothes on his back. He had worked his way through school, learned English, and eventually earned an engineering degree. By the time he met Jacqueline, he was working as an engineer at Exxon. Miguel officially adopted Jeff when Jeff was 4 years old. From that point forward, Jeff took the Bezos name and considered Miguel his father. Ted Jorgensen faded from the picture so completely that Jeff would later say he hadn't thought about his biological father in years. Miguel was his dad, the only father he knew or wanted to know. And Miguel brought something crucial into Jeff's life beyond just paternal presence. He brought an immigrant's hunger, an engineer's discipline, and a powerful example of what was possible in America if you were willing to work hard enough and smart enough. The most important influence in young Jeff's life, beyond his parents, was his maternal grandfather, Lawrence Preston Jies. Pop Jies, as Jeff called him, was a formidable figure. He had been a regional director for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, managing operations at weapons laboratories and test sites. After retiring from government service, he had bought a 25,000-acre ranch in Catala, Texas. Every summer, Jeff and his younger siblings would spend weeks or even months at the ranch with Pop Jies. These summers were transformative. Pop Jies was a man of extraordinary competence and self-reliance. On the ranch, there were no stores, no services, no one to call when something broke. Everything had to be fixed, improvised, or invented on the spot. And Pop Jies could fix anything. He repaired heavy machinery, built structures, solved complex problems with whatever materials were at hand, performed veterinary medicine on cattle, and managed every aspect of the ranch's operation. Jeff absorbed this ethos completely. Pop Jies didn't believe in buying new equipment when old equipment could be repaired. He didn't believe in calling experts when you could figure it out yourself. Years later, Bezos would describe these summers as the most formative experiences of his childhood. He learned that there were no problems that couldn't be solved with enough ingenuity and effort. He learned that you didn't need permission or perfect tools to build what you needed. He learned that self-reliance wasn't just a value, it was a survival skill. And he learned something else critical. He learned to love hard problems, to find joy in the challenge itself, not just the solution. One story from the ranch captures this perfectly. When Jeff was about 12, he decided he wanted to build an automatic gate opener for a cattle chute. This was not a simple project. It required understanding mechanical systems, basic electronics, and problem solving through multiple failures. Pop Jies didn't tell him how to do it or whether it was possible. He just gave Jeff access to tools and scrap materials and let him figure it out. Jeff spent weeks that summer working on the project, failing repeatedly, learning from each failure, adjusting his approach. Eventually, he built a working system. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. More importantly, he had proven to himself that he could envision something that didn't exist and then make it real through pure persistence and ingenuity. This constant message of figure it out yourself created something important in Jeff. It created an internal locus of control, a deep belief that outcomes were within his power to change, that he wasn't subject to circumstances but could shape circumstances to his will. This would become one of his defining characteristics, this refusal to accept constraints as permanent, this insistence that nearly any problem could be solved with enough creative thinking and persistent effort. But Jeff's childhood wasn't all ranch summers and happy problem solving. His parents had high expectations. Miguel, as an immigrant who had overcome extraordinary obstacles, believed deeply in hard work, education, and achievement. Jacqueline, who had pulled herself up from teenage single motherhood to a stable middle-class life, had no patience for excuses or mediocrity. They pushed Jeff hard academically, enrolling him in gifted programs, expecting excellent grades, creating an environment where achievement was not just encouraged but demanded. Jeff responded to this pressure by becoming intensely, almost obsessively focused on intellectual achievement. He was the kid who actually enjoyed standardized tests, who saw them as puzzles to be solved. He loved math and science, devouring books about physics, space exploration, and technology. He was fascinated by Star Trek, not just as entertainment but as a vision of what humanity could become. He read science fiction voraciously, drawn particularly to stories about space colonization and humanity's expansion beyond Earth. These weren't just fantasies for him. They were blueprints for a future he wanted to help build. By middle school, Jeff's intellectual intensity was becoming more apparent and sometimes socially problematic. He was the kid who always knew the answer, who always had his hand up, who corrected teachers when they made mistakes. His teachers noticed something else about him beyond just intelligence. He had an unusual ability to focus completely on problems that interested him, losing himself for hours in calculations or designs or books. And he had a quality that would become even more pronounced later, an almost frightening level of confidence in his own reasoning. When Jeff reached a conclusion after thinking through something carefully, he didn't just believe he was right. He knew he was right, and it was very difficult to convince him otherwise. This confidence would serve him extraordinarily well later in his career. In high school, Jeff's intensity ramped up further. He attended Miami Palmetto Senior High School, a strong academic school where he was surrounded by other bright, ambitious students. He was valedictorian of his class, graduating in 1982. But more than just grades, he was starting to show early signs of the person he would become. He was intensely interested in space exploration, so interested that he gave his high school valedictorian speech about space colonization and humanity's need to develop space resources to survive. He wasn't making small talk about high school memories. He was laying out a vision for the future of human civilization. He also showed early entrepreneurial instincts. One summer, he and his girlfriend created an educational summer camp for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders called the Dream Institute. They charged $600 per student for a 2-week program covering topics like creative writing, problem solving, and exploration of academic interests. They created curriculum, recruited students, ran the program. It wasn't a major business success, but it showed Jeff's willingness to simply create things that didn't exist if he saw a need or opportunity. In 1982, Jeff enrolled at Princeton University. He had been accepted to multiple top schools but chose Princeton partly for its excellent engineering program. He initially intended to study physics, dreaming of becoming a theoretical physicist. But in a sophomore year physics class, he encountered problem sets that showed him his limitations. He was working incredibly hard and barely keeping up, while some of his classmates seemed to solve problems effortlessly. This was a pivotal moment. For the first time in his life, Jeff encountered something he couldn't simply overcome through more effort and persistence. He wasn't going to be one of the top theoretical physicists in the world. He could see that clearly. Some of his classmates had a kind of intuitive mathematical genius that he simply didn't possess. He made a pragmatic decision. He switched majors to electrical engineering and computer science. He was still brilliant in these fields, still at the top of his class, but he wasn't hitting the same wall he hit in theoretical physics. This decision reveals something important about Bezos that would characterize his entire career. He was ambitious and confident, but he was also deeply pragmatic. At Princeton, Jeff thrived academically but remained somewhat socially awkward. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa, the prestigious academic honor society. He graduated summa cum laude in 1986 with degrees in electrical engineering and computer science. His senior thesis was on the topic of building an artificial intelligence system for protein folding. But beyond academics, Jeff was starting to show other qualities that would define his later career. He was intensely curious about how businesses worked and how money was made. He would read business biographies voraciously, fascinated by stories of how entrepreneurs built companies from nothing. As he approached graduation, Jeff faced a choice about his career path. He had offers from several technology companies, including Intel. But he chose to go to New York and work in finance. This seemed like an odd choice for someone who loved building things and dreamed of space exploration. But it was deeply strategic. Jeff had done the math. In the tech companies, even successful ones, equity was distributed across many employees, and the upside for individual engineers was limited. In finance, particularly in the new world of quantitative trading and hedge funds, individuals who could figure out mathematical edges could make enormous amounts of money quickly. Jeff wasn't going to Wall Street because he loved finance. He was going because it was the fastest path to accumulating serious capital. He had already intuited something that would guide his entire career. To do the big things he wanted to do eventually, he would need resources, credibility, and freedom. Working his way up in a big company would take decades. Making a lot of money quickly in finance could give him the capital and credibility to eventually do what he really wanted, which was build something transformative. Jeff Bezos arrived on Wall Street in 1986 at age 22, joining a small startup firm called Fattel. The company was building a network to facilitate international trade transactions, essentially creating early digital infrastructure for financial communications. It was the perfect entry point for someone with Jeff's technical skills and growing business interests. In 1988, Jeff moved to Bankers Trust Company, working in the company's emerging technology division. Here he got his first deep exposure to how major financial institutions actually operated, how money moved through the system. At Bankers Trust, Jeff stood out immediately. He wasn't just technically brilliant. He had an unusual ability to see systems holistically, to understand how different pieces fit together, and to identify inefficiencies that could be optimized. He rose quickly, becoming the youngest vice president in the company's history at age 26. But the real transformation in Jeff's career came in 1990 when he joined D.E. Shaw & Company. This was a turning point, the job that would directly shape everything that came after. D.E. Shaw was not a typical Wall Street firm. It had been founded in 1988 by David Shaw, a former Columbia computer science professor who had a radical idea. Instead of hiring traditional Wall Street types, traders who relied on intuition and relationships, Shaw would hire scientists and engineers, people who could build mathematical models to find edges in markets. When Jeff joined D.E. Shaw, the firm was still small, fewer than 50 employees, but it was growing rapidly and generating extraordinary returns. Jeff quickly became one of Shaw's most valued employees. He rose extraordinarily quickly, becoming senior vice president in just 4 years, by 1994. Shaw began signaling that Jeff was on track for partnership and might even eventually run the firm. But beyond just the work itself, being at D.E. Shaw was giving Jeff something crucial. It was teaching him how to think about business opportunities at a level he had never encountered before. Shaw's entire approach was based on a framework that would profoundly shape how Jeff thought about entrepreneurship. You start with data, you identify patterns and trends, you model the opportunity mathematically, you think through the game theory and competitive dynamics. Jeff was absorbing this methodology completely. He was learning how to look at industries and ask, what are the fundamental drivers here? What's changing? What discontinuities are creating opportunities? What edges could be built that would compound over time? This training would prove crucial when he later built Amazon, because he would approach it not as a traditional merchant but as an engineer building a system. During his years at D.E. Shaw, from 1990 to 1994, Jeff was also building crucial relationships. He met Mackenzie Tuttle, a research associate at D.E. Shaw who had graduated from Princeton with a degree in English. They married in 1993. Jeff was also learning what it felt like to be wealthy. By his early 30s, he was earning well over $300,000 a year in base salary, plus significant bonuses. For someone who had grown up solidly middle class, this level of financial success was meaningful. But it also created a particular kind of pressure. He now had something significant to lose. Walking away from this level of compensation and career trajectory to start a risky venture would mean giving up not just income but status, trajectory, and the approval of everyone around him. And yet, by early 1994, Jeff was growing restless. The work at D.E. Shaw was fascinating, and he was very good at it. But something was missing. He wasn't building something permanent. He was making money by finding edges in markets, but those edges were temporary. Then came the moment that changed everything. In spring 1994, Jeff was asked to research potential opportunities in the emerging internet space. David Shaw, always looking for new edges, wanted to understand if there were business opportunities in this new technology that was starting to generate excitement. Jeff dove into the research with his typical intensity. And what he found stunned him. The data showed that web usage was growing at 2,300% per year. Jeff had to check the calculation multiple times because it seemed impossible. Nothing grew at that rate. Traditional retail grew at maybe 2 to 3% annually. But this internet thing was growing at 2,300% per year. That meant it was doubling every few months. Jeff started to model what this meant. If web usage was growing this fast, then commerce would inevitably follow. He started researching what products would make sense to sell online. Books emerged as the obvious choice. Books were commoditized, you didn't need to see them in person to buy them. Books had enormous selection, millions of titles in print, far more than any physical bookstore could stock. And books were small, light, and easy to ship. But Jeff wasn't just thinking about books. He was thinking about something larger. He saw that the internet wasn't just a new sales channel. It was a fundamentally different way of organizing commerce. In physical retail, you were limited by geography and shelf space. But online, geography didn't matter, and shelf space was infinite. You could offer every book ever printed to every person with internet access anywhere in the world. He did what he always did. He built models. He calculated what kind of market share would be realistic for an online bookstore. He estimated the costs of building the infrastructure, marketing to acquire customers, and operational expenses. The numbers were striking. Yes, the business would lose money for years as it built infrastructure and acquired customers. But if you captured even a small percentage of total book sales, the revenue would eventually be enormous. Jeff took his findings to David Shaw. Shaw listened carefully to the whole presentation. And Shaw saw exactly what Jeff saw. This was a massive opportunity. Shaw's response was to suggest that D.E. Shaw itself launch an online bookstore. But Jeff had a different reaction. Once he had seen the opportunity clearly, something shifted in him. He didn't want to build this as part of D.E. Shaw. He wanted to build it himself. This was the thing he had been unconsciously preparing for his entire life. Shaw, recognizing what was happening, asked Jeff to take a walk with him through Central Park. They walked for 2 hours. Shaw laid out the case against leaving with genuine care and concern. The odds were that the company would fail. Jeff would lose years of career progression. He would be starting over in his mid-30s. Jeff listened to all of this. He told Shaw he needed time to think. But he already knew. He went home and talked to Mackenzie. She saw immediately that he had already made up his mind emotionally and was just trying to justify it rationally. She told him to do it. Jeff then created what he would later call his regret minimization framework. He imagined himself at age 80, looking back at his life. From that perspective, would he regret leaving Wall Street to try this internet startup, even if it failed completely? No. That would be a great story, a great adventure. But would he regret not trying, regret playing it safe and watching someone else build what he could have built? Yes, absolutely. That regret would be enormous. Once he framed it that way, the decision was obvious. In May 1994, just weeks after that walk in Central Park, Jeff gave notice to David Shaw. Shaw was disappointed but not angry. He understood. Jeff's colleagues at D.E. Shaw thought he was crazy. Here was someone who had made it, who was on track for extraordinary success in a lucrative field, walking away to start a bookstore on the internet. They held a farewell party where the predominant emotion wasn't celebration but confusion and concern. They were watching someone they thought was brilliant make what seemed like a catastrophic career mistake. But Jeff wasn't uncertain. Once he made the decision, he moved with extraordinary speed and focus. He and Mackenzie packed their belongings into their Chevy Blazer. They were heading to Seattle. As Mackenzie drove across the country, Jeff sat in the passenger seat with a laptop, typing out the business plan. The audacity of this vision cannot be overstated. In 1994, e-commerce barely existed. Most people had never bought anything online. The web browsers were crude and slow. And Jeff was proposing to build the world's largest bookstore as his first business. But Jeff had something most entrepreneurs didn't have. He had the quantitative discipline and modeling skills from D.E. Shaw. He had thought through the game theory. He understood that whoever moved first and fastest in building the customer base and infrastructure would have compounding advantages that would be very difficult for later entrants to overcome. He also understood something crucial about timing. The opportunity existed because of a specific confluence of factors that wouldn't last forever. Web usage was exploding but e-commerce was still nascent. The window was now, in 1994, and it wouldn't stay open for long. On July 5, 1994, Jeff officially incorporated the company as Amazon.com. He and Mackenzie had rented a house in the Seattle suburb of Bellevue. They converted the garage into Amazon's first office and warehouse. Jeff built the first desks out of doors and 4x4s from Home Depot, a hack that became famous later as a symbol of Amazon's frugality. He recruited a few early employees, including Shel Kappan, a talented programmer who became employee number 1. The first challenge was technical. They needed to build a website that could display books, process orders, handle credit card transactions, and track inventory. This was not trivial in 1994. E-commerce software barely existed. They had to build everything from scratch. The second challenge was logistics. They needed relationships with book distributors and publishers. Jeff flew around the country meeting with Ingram, Baker, and Taylor, and other major distributors. Most were skeptical. An online bookstore? Who would buy books that way? But they agreed to work with him. The third challenge was harder to solve. How do you get customers when nobody knows you exist and most people have never bought anything online? Jeff's solution was elegantly simple. He would launch with an inventory of 1 million titles. No physical bookstore could match that selection. Barnes & Noble's largest stores had maybe 200,000 titles. An online store with 1 million titles would be objectively superior in selection to any physical alternative. That would be the value proposition. In July 1995, exactly 1 year after incorporation, Amazon.com went live. The site was crude by modern standards. But it worked. Jeff and his small team waited nervously to see if anyone would actually use it. The first week, they received orders from people in all 50 states and 45 countries. Jeff was stunned. This validated everything he had believed. People wanted this. Within the first month, Amazon was selling $20,000 worth of books per week, far exceeding Jeff's most optimistic projections. The growth was exponential. But this created an entirely new problem. They were growing so fast that they couldn't keep up. Orders were piling up faster than they could ship them. The garage had become completely inadequate. They moved to a small warehouse space and hired more people. Jeff had a bell that would ring every time an order came in through the website. At first, everyone would gather around and cheer. But within weeks, the bell was ringing so constantly that they had to turn it off because it was too disruptive. This was a powerful symbol. They had created something that people wanted at a scale none of them had quite anticipated. By the end of 1995, Amazon had generated over $500,000 in revenue. More importantly, the growth trajectory was clear. They were doubling every few months. Jeff could see that the model worked. But now he faced a new challenge. To grow at the rate the market opportunity demanded, he needed serious capital. Jeff had bootstrapped the company initially with money from his own savings and from family and friends. His parents, Jackie and Mike Bezos, had invested $300,000, nearly their entire life savings, in their son's crazy internet bookstore idea. But family money wasn't enough for what came next. Jeff needed to raise real venture capital. In early 1996, he began pitching venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. This was not an easy pitch. Most VCs were skeptical of e-commerce. The narrative at the time was that nobody would buy things online. But Jeff was persistent. He refined his pitch with each meeting. Finally, in May 1996, Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers, one of Silicon Valley's most prestigious venture capital firms, led an $8 million Series A investment in Amazon. John Doerr, one of the most respected VCs in Silicon Valley, joined Amazon's board. But this investment came with pressure. Kleiner Perkins expected rapid growth. Jeff now had professional investors to answer to. He had to execute flawlessly. Jeff embraced this pressure. He was in the office or warehouse from early morning until late at night, every day. By the end of 1996, Amazon was doing $16 million in annual revenue and growing at over 3,000% year-over-year. The website was being improved constantly, adding features like customer reviews, which would become one of Amazon's most important innovations. And Jeff was already thinking about expansion beyond books. But to realize that vision, Jeff needed to do something that felt incredibly risky. He needed to take Amazon public, even though the company was not just unprofitable but losing money at an increasing rate. This was a radical idea in 1997. Wall Street was already skeptical of internet companies. Taking a money-losing bookstore public seemed like the epitome of bubble insanity to many traditional investors. But Jeff had a clear vision of why this was the right move. The window of opportunity was open. If Amazon didn't move aggressively now, someone else would. On May 15, 1997, Amazon.com went public at $18 per share, raising $54 million. On the first day of trading, the stock jumped to $30 per share. Jeff Bezos, at age 33, was suddenly worth about $60 million on paper. More importantly, Amazon now had the capital to execute on his vision at the speed and scale he believed was necessary. But going public created new pressures. Jeff now had quarterly earnings calls, public shareholders, analyst scrutiny, and media attention. This is where Jeff's formation at D.E. Shaw proved crucial. He could articulate the quantitative logic, explain the customer lifetime value calculations, walk through the network effects and scale economies. He presented investing in Amazon not as an emotional bet on a charismatic founder but as a rigorous mathematical investment in a business model with powerful economics that would reveal themselves over time. Some investors bought this logic. Many didn't. But enough did that Amazon had the capital to execute. The late 1990s were a strange time to be building an internet company. The dot-com bubble was inflating rapidly. Money was pouring into anything with .com in the name. In this environment, Amazon looked to many observers like just another bubble company. Yes, revenue was growing explosively, but losses were growing just as fast. Amazon lost $31 million in 1997 and $124 million in 1998. Jeff's response to this criticism was to accelerate investment, not slow it down. But this strategy required convincing investors and the public that the losses were strategic, not a sign of business failure. Jeff's approach was to overcommunicate the logic at every opportunity. He was essentially teaching investors to evaluate Amazon using his framework, not traditional retail metrics. The criticism intensified as Amazon expanded beyond books. In 1998, Amazon added music and videos. In 1999, electronics, toys, home improvement, and software. Critics argued that Amazon was losing focus. Jeff saw it differently. The same infrastructure that shipped books could ship anything. The same customer relationships could be leveraged across categories. The expansion wasn't smooth. When Amazon launched toys for the 1999 Christmas season, demand exceeded their ability to fulfill. They ran out of stock on popular items. Jeff's response was typically analytical. He didn't deny the problems or make excuses. He explained what went wrong, what they were doing to fix it, and what systems they were building to ensure it didn't happen again. By 2000, as the dot-com bubble reached its peak, Amazon stock had reached over $100 per share. Jeff was on the cover of Time magazine as Person of the Year for 1999. But beneath this celebration, the business was facing real challenges. Competition was intensifying. And the losses were getting harder to defend. Amazon lost $719 million in 1999 and lost $1.4 billion in 2000. More troubling, the capital markets were starting to close. After the Nasdaq peaked in March 2000, the dot-com bubble began to burst. Internet stocks crashed. Amazon stock crashed from over $100 in December 1999 to under $6 by October 2001, a decline of over 90%. If Amazon couldn't raise more capital and couldn't cut its way to profitability quickly enough, it would run out of cash and fail. The media narrative shifted dramatically. Jeff went from visionary to cautionary tale. Articles appeared predicting Amazon would run out of cash within a year. Even Jeff's mother called him worried. Jeff's response to this crisis was characteristically data-driven and ruthlessly pragmatic. He broke the problem down into components. How much cash did Amazon have? How much were they burning per month? How quickly could they cut costs? He assembled his leadership team and told them they had to get to cash flow positive within 12 months or the company would die. This triggered massive cost cutting. Amazon closed fulfillment centers that weren't essential. They laid off 1,300 employees. They canceled expansion plans. Jeff personally reviewed major expenses and cut anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. But Jeff was also clear about what they wouldn't cut. They wouldn't cut customer experience. They wouldn't cut technology investment. They wouldn't fire their best people. The cuts had to be surgical, removing waste while protecting the core capabilities that made Amazon valuable. At the same time, Jeff was managing the external narrative. He needed to convince investors, lenders, and suppliers that Amazon would survive. He gave interviews explaining the path to profitability. Slowly, he rebuilt credibility. The turning point came in 2001 when Amazon negotiated a $665 million loan from a group of banks. This capital injection gave Amazon breathing room. With the pressure of imminent bankruptcy lifted, Jeff could return to strategic thinking. What had the crisis revealed? He concluded several things. First, Amazon had grown too fast without enough operational discipline. Second, they had underestimated the difficulty of logistics at scale. Third, they needed to diversify revenue streams. They needed higher margin businesses. These insights led to two major strategic shifts. First, Amazon would build world-class operations and logistics capabilities. Second, Amazon would launch new businesses that leveraged its infrastructure but had better economics than retail. This would lead to Amazon Marketplace and eventually Amazon Web Services. But before we explore those transformations, we need to understand a crucial investment Amazon made during this period. In November 2000, at the very bottom of the dot-com crash, when Amazon's survival was in question, Jeff made a massive bet. He invested in building a national network of fulfillment centers. This seemed insane to many observers. Why invest billions in warehouses when you're losing money? Jeff's logic was straightforward. The crisis had created an opportunity. Real estate was cheap. Construction costs were low. Competitors were retrenching. If Amazon built the infrastructure now, they would have a multi-year lead when growth returned. By the end of 2001, Amazon had weathered the storm. They had achieved positive operating cash flow. Revenue was still growing. They had a viable path to profitability. Amazon was going to survive. The early 2000s were a period of relative quiet for Amazon in terms of public attention. The dot-com crash had wiped out most of Amazon's competitors. But during this period, Jeff Bezos was quietly transforming Amazon in ways that would prove more important than all the headline-grabbing growth of the late 1990s. The key insight driving this transformation came from stepping back and asking a fundamental question. What is Amazon's real business? The obvious answer was retail. But Jeff saw something deeper. Amazon's real business was building systems to make buying and selling easier. This question led to two transformative initiatives. Amazon Marketplace, which allowed third-party sellers to list products on Amazon's website alongside Amazon's own inventory, and Amazon Web Services, which turned Amazon's internal technology infrastructure into services that other companies could use. Both ideas seemed crazy to many people at the time. Why help competitors? But Jeff saw platform opportunities with powerful network effects and much better economics than retail. Amazon Marketplace launched in November 2000, right in the middle of Amazon's existential crisis. The initial idea was simple. Allow third-party sellers to list used books alongside Amazon's new book listings. Customers won because they had more options. Sellers won because they got access to Amazon's huge customer base. Amazon won because they earned a commission on every sale without having to carry inventory. But the early days were rough. Allowing third-party sellers to compete directly on Amazon's own website felt threatening to many Amazon employees. Jeff's response was to look at the data. Marketplace sales were growing faster than first-party sales. Customers loved having more selection and lower prices. The commission revenue had much better margins than retail. And most importantly, Marketplace was driving network effects. So instead of pulling back, Jeff doubled down. Amazon built better seller tools. They created Fulfillment by Amazon, where sellers could send inventory to Amazon's warehouses and Amazon would handle storage and shipping for a fee. The results were remarkable. By 2006, third-party sales exceeded Amazon's first-party retail sales for the first time. But Marketplace was just the beginning. The second and even more transformative platform was Amazon Web Services. In the early 2000s, Amazon had built significant internal technology infrastructure to support its growing retail business. Around 2003, some Amazon engineers began asking a different question. What if we offered these capabilities as services that other companies could use? Instead of every company building their own data centers, what if they could rent computing power and storage from Amazon? This was the essence of cloud computing. When this idea was brought to Jeff, his response was characteristic. He didn't dismiss it because it was different from Amazon's core business. He asked analytical questions. The team worked through these questions systematically. They concluded that if computing power and storage followed cost curves similar to Moore's law, continuing to get exponentially cheaper, then eventually all companies would move to cloud infrastructure. Jeff approved the investment in 2003. The first AWS services launched in 2004 and 2006. S3 let companies store data in Amazon's infrastructure. EC2 let companies rent virtual servers by the hour. The initial customers were mostly startups who couldn't afford their own data centers. Companies like Dropbox, Airbnb, and Netflix were built entirely on AWS infrastructure. But established companies were skeptical. AWS focused obsessively on fundamentals. When there were outages, they published detailed postmortems. When costs declined, they passed savings to customers through price cuts. The growth was explosive but almost invisible to the outside world. AWS revenue wasn't broken out separately in Amazon's financial reporting until 2015. The strategic implications were profound. AWS made Amazon's retail losses almost irrelevant. Even if retail generated thin margins or losses, AWS was so profitable that it funded all of Amazon's other investments. When Amazon wanted to invest in original video content or build out more fulfillment centers or launch new businesses, AWS generated the cash to fund it. Moreover, AWS demonstrated that Jeff's approach to building platforms was systematically valuable. This pattern would repeat again and again as Amazon launched new businesses. But during this period from 2002 to 2007, while Jeff was building these transformative platforms, he was also managing persistent criticism about Amazon's profitability. Despite all the progress, Amazon's operating margins remained thin. The criticism was that Jeff was choosing growth over profits. There was truth to this. Jeff had a strong bias toward investment and growth. His logic was that in a rapidly growing market, the returns to investing in growth far exceeded the returns to optimizing current profitability. This debate came to a head in 2007 when several senior executives pushed Jeff to focus on profitability. Jeff listened to these arguments carefully. He even agreed to experiment with pulling back growth investment to see what margins looked like. For a few quarters in 2007 and 2008, Amazon reduced spending growth and let margins expand. The stock did respond positively. But Jeff wasn't satisfied. He could see in the data that the growth opportunities were still massive. So Jeff made a decision that would define Amazon's next decade. He communicated to investors that Amazon would return to investing heavily for growth. This period from 2002 to 2007 was crucial for Jeff's development as a leader and strategist. He learned that building platforms with network effects could generate far better economics than traditional retail. He learned that internal capabilities could often be turned into external businesses. He learned that managing investor expectations and being willing to be misunderstood was essential for long-term value creation. These lessons would shape everything Amazon did in its next phase. If the first era of Amazon was about survival and the second era was about platform building, the third era was about expansion into seemingly every market where Amazon's capabilities could create value. During this period from 2007 to 2015, Amazon launched dozens of major new initiatives, entered multiple new industries, made controversial acquisitions, and faced escalating scrutiny about its market power. Jeff Bezos evolved from scrappy entrepreneur to one of the world's most powerful business leaders. The catalyst for this expansion was the success of AWS and Marketplace. These businesses demonstrated that Amazon's model could work beyond retail. They generated high-margin revenue that could fund investments in new businesses. The first major expansion during this period was into hardware devices. In November 2007, Amazon launched the Kindle, an e-reader designed specifically for consuming digital books. This was a radical departure for Amazon. They had never designed and manufactured consumer electronics. But Jeff saw the strategic logic clearly. Physical books had inherent limitations. Digital books could be delivered instantly at near zero marginal cost. The initial Kindle was expensive at $399 and had significant limitations. But Jeff had modeled the economics carefully. The Kindle didn't need to be profitable on hardware sales. If it drove digital book sales, which had much higher margins than physical books, the economics worked beautifully. The Kindle succeeded beyond initial expectations. It sold out in 5.5 hours on launch day. But the real significance of Kindle wasn't the device itself. It was what it taught Amazon about hardware and ecosystem building. In June 2014, Amazon launched the Fire Phone, a smartphone designed to compete with iPhone and Android devices. This was Jeff's personal passion project. The Fire Phone was a spectacular failure. It launched at $650 but without the ecosystem or brand cachet that Apple had built. Within months, Amazon cut the price to 99 cents and eventually wrote off $170 million in unsold inventory. This was one of Jeff's biggest mistakes. But characteristically, Jeff extracted lessons from it. Amazon shouldn't try to compete head-to-head with Apple without a compelling differentiated value proposition. But while the Fire Phone failed, another hardware initiative was succeeding quietly. In November 2014, Amazon launched Echo, a voice-activated speaker with a built-in assistant called Alexa. Echo seemed like an odd product for Amazon. But Jeff saw something others missed. Voice was going to be the next major interface for computing. Whoever dominated voice would control how people accessed information and services. Echo launched with modest expectations, but customers loved it. The real strategic value of Echo wasn't hardware revenue. It was creating an ecosystem around Alexa. Beyond hardware, Amazon was expanding aggressively in content. In 2011, Amazon launched Prime Video, offering streaming video as a benefit of Prime membership. This put Amazon in direct competition with Netflix. Most observers thought this was foolish. Jeff's logic was different. Prime Video wasn't primarily about competing with Netflix. It was about making Prime membership more valuable. But Jeff took this strategy a step further. Instead of just licensing content, Amazon would produce original content. The investment in content was enormous. By 2014, Amazon was spending over $2 billion annually on video content. This shocked Wall Street. Why was an online retailer spending billions on TV shows? Jeff's answer was always the same. Prime members who watch video spend more on Amazon than Prime members who don't. The video content pays for itself through increased retail engagement. This willingness to invest in seemingly unrelated businesses that drove retail engagement was becoming a hallmark of Jeff's approach. During this period, Amazon was also expanding internationally with renewed intensity. Jeff decided Amazon needed to win internationally. He pushed for much more aggressive investment, particularly in India. Amazon entered India in 2013 and committed to investing billions to win the market. The India expansion exemplified Jeff's approach to international markets. Go big, move fast, and be willing to lose money for years to build market position. The losses from India were substantial, hundreds of millions annually. But Jeff was playing a long game. By 2015, Amazon had become a bewildering conglomerate of businesses. Online retail in dozens of categories and countries. Third-party marketplace. AWS cloud infrastructure. Kindle e-readers. Echo speakers with Alexa. Prime Video with original content. Amazon Fresh grocery delivery. The breadth was staggering. This diversification created tension with investors who struggled to value Amazon. Jeff's response was to focus relentlessly on metrics that mattered to him. Free cash flow, not GAAP earnings. Customer accounts and engagement, not margin percentages. But this diversification also created internal management challenges. How do you run a company that operates in so many different businesses? Jeff's solution was to maintain a strong unified culture while giving individual businesses significant autonomy. The culture was defined by mechanisms. Written narratives instead of PowerPoint. Working backwards from customer needs. Bar raisers in hiring. This cultural consistency was crucial for maintaining coordination. But it also created problems. The same intense work culture that drove innovation also led to employee burnout. In August 2015, the New York Times published a lengthy investigation into Amazon's workplace culture titled "Inside Amazon: Wrestling Big Ideas in a Bruising Workplace." The article painted a picture of a company that demanded extraordinary commitment from employees. The article created a firestorm of criticism. Jeff rarely responded to criticism publicly, but this article prompted him to write a memo to employees. He said the culture described was not the culture he wanted. But the criticism persisted and expanded beyond corporate offices to fulfillment centers. Jeff's response to this criticism revealed something important about his leadership. He didn't dismiss the concerns or deny problems existed. He acknowledged that Amazon needed to do better. Amazon increased minimum wages, improved benefits, and invested in safety programs. But Jeff also didn't apologize for having high standards or expecting intense work. The mission was enormous. That required exceptional people working at exceptional levels. This tension between high-performance culture and employee well-being would become a defining issue for Amazon. By the end of 2015, Amazon had grown to a $107 billion revenue company. Jeff Bezos, at age 51, was no longer just a successful entrepreneur. He was one of the most powerful business leaders in the world. His net worth had grown to over $50 billion. And he was positioning Amazon for another transformation into areas that would raise even more profound questions about Amazon's power and influence. The period from 2015 to 2021 marked Amazon's transformation from a successful company into one of the most dominant and controversial corporations in human history. Amazon's market capitalization grew from $200 billion to over $1.6 trillion. Jeff Bezos became the world's richest person, with wealth exceeding $200 billion. And the questions about Amazon's market power, labor practices, and societal impact shifted from academic discussions to mainstream political debates. The pivot point for this era came with two major events in 2015 and 2016. First, in April 2015, Amazon finally broke out AWS revenue and operating income as a separate reporting segment. This revealed what insiders had known but the market hadn't fully appreciated. AWS was enormous, generating over $7 billion in revenue in 2015, growing at over 50% annually, and producing operating margins of over 25%. This was a business generating nearly $2 billion in annual operating income, more than all of Amazon's retail operations combined. The revelation transformed how investors valued Amazon. Suddenly, Amazon wasn't an online retailer that happened to have a cloud business. It was a highly profitable technology infrastructure company using those profits to fund aggressive expansion. This revaluation triggered explosive growth in Amazon's stock price. From around $400 per share in early 2015, Amazon stock climbed to over $1,600 by mid-2017. Jeff's net worth grew proportionally. By mid-2017, he was the richest person in the world. The second transformative event was Amazon's launch of grocery delivery and its eventual acquisition of Whole Foods. Grocery was the holy grail of e-commerce, representing over $700 billion in annual US spending but with almost no online penetration. In June 2017, Amazon made a stunning announcement. It would acquire Whole Foods Market for $13.7 billion, Amazon's largest acquisition ever. The acquisition gave Amazon immediate physical presence in grocery. The market reaction was extraordinary. Amazon stock jumped on the news. But stocks of every grocery chain and big box retailer crashed. The message was clear. If Amazon was serious about grocery, everyone else was in trouble. But the Whole Foods acquisition also intensified scrutiny of Amazon's market power. If Amazon could enter the massive grocery market and immediately disrupt incumbents just by announcing an acquisition, what did that say about competitive dynamics? These questions were being raised not just about grocery but across Amazon's entire footprint. In retail categories from books to electronics to apparel, Amazon's share was growing relentlessly. Shopping malls were closing. Department stores were filing for bankruptcy. Thousands of small retailers were going out of business. Was this just normal creative destruction, or was Amazon engaging in predatory practices? The criticism intensified when examining Amazon's treatment of third-party sellers on its marketplace. By 2017, over half of Amazon's retail sales came from third-party sellers. These millions of sellers depended on Amazon for access to customers. But Amazon also competed directly with many of these sellers through its private label brands. And Amazon had access to all the data about what sellers were selling. Reports emerged of Amazon using this data to identify successful products, then launching competing private label versions at lower prices. The potential for abuse was enormous. Similar concerns arose about AWS. Amazon competed with thousands of software companies that used AWS infrastructure. Amazon could see exactly how those companies' products were being used. And Amazon would sometimes launch competing services that looked remarkably similar to successful startups. By 2018 and 2019, these concerns had moved into mainstream political discourse. Presidential candidates began proposing breaking up Amazon. Congressional hearings investigated Amazon's market power. Amazon, along with Google, Facebook, and Apple, became symbols of tech platform power that many believed had grown too large to control. Jeff's response to these criticisms evolved during this period. Initially, he largely ignored them, believing Amazon's actions were clearly legal and pro-consumer. But as the criticism intensified, Jeff began engaging more directly. In congressional testimony in July 2020, which was conducted remotely due to the COVID pandemic, Jeff defended Amazon's practices while acknowledging concerns. The testimony was notable for what it revealed about how Jeff thought about Amazon's power and responsibility. He genuinely believed Amazon was a positive force. But he seemed to recognize that scale itself created obligations. These considerations became more acute during the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit in early 2020. The pandemic was a defining moment for Amazon, revealing both its enormous utility and its profound influence. As lockdowns forced people to stay home, Amazon became essential infrastructure. Millions of people depended on Amazon for delivery of everything they needed. Amazon's logistics network suddenly proved crucial for maintaining commerce during a global crisis. But the pandemic also exposed Amazon's labor practices to intense scrutiny. Warehouse workers were deemed essential, required to keep working while white-collar employees worked from home. Reports emerged of unsafe conditions in fulfillment centers, inadequate protective equipment, and workers afraid to take sick days. Jeff's response was to invest heavily in safety measures and worker support. Amazon spent over $4 billion on COVID-related expenses in 2020. Amazon also hired hundreds of thousands of additional workers to meet surging demand. But the criticism persisted. Labor organizers argued that Amazon's response was inadequate. Workers at several fulfillment centers attempted to unionize. Amazon fought these unionization efforts aggressively. The most prominent effort was at a fulfillment center in Bessemer, Alabama, where workers voted in early 2021 on whether to join a union. The campaign drew national attention. Jeff was personally criticized for Amazon's anti-union tactics. The unionization vote failed decisively, with workers voting more than 2-1 against the union. These labor controversies occurred against the backdrop of Jeff's personal life becoming increasingly public. In January 2019, Jeff and Mackenzie announced they were divorcing after 25 years of marriage. The announcement came shortly after a tabloid published a story revealing Jeff was having an affair. The divorce and affair became a media sensation. Jeff's personal life, which he had successfully kept separate from his business life for decades, was suddenly entangled. Jeff responded with a rare personal blog post in which he published emails showing he had been threatened with extortion. This was classic Jeff, turning what seemed like a crisis into a position of strength. The divorce was finalized in April 2019. Mackenzie received 25% of the couple's Amazon stock, making her one of the wealthiest women in the world. She quickly announced she would donate much of her wealth to charity. Within 2 years, she had donated over $8 billion to various causes. Jeff's public relationship with his new partner seemed to change something about his public persona. He became more public and more visibly wealthy. He seemed to embrace his status as one of the world's richest and most powerful people rather than trying to downplay it. This shift coincided with another major development. In February 2021, Jeff announced he would step down as CEO of Amazon. He would transition to executive chairman, focusing on new initiatives like Blue Origin, while Andy Jassy would become CEO. This was a historic transition. Jeff had been CEO since Amazon's founding 27 years earlier. The decision wasn't about retirement. Jeff was 57 and as energetically engaged as ever. It was about focus. Amazon had grown so large that running it required enormous time. Jeff wanted to focus on what he considered the most important long-term opportunities, particularly space exploration. Blue Origin had been Jeff's personal passion project since he founded it in 2000. The company's mission was to enable millions of people to live and work in space. This had been Jeff's childhood dream. He believed it was also a practical necessity. Earth's resources were finite. To continue growing, humanity needed to expand into space. But Blue Origin's progress had been slow, especially compared to SpaceX. Jeff's decision to step back from Amazon was partly motivated by a desire to give Blue Origin the attention that had made Amazon successful. The transition to Andy Jassy as CEO was carefully managed. Andy had been at Amazon since 1997, had built AWS from the ground up, and understood Amazon's culture deeply. The handoff occurred in July 2021, exactly 27 years after Jeff drove across the country to start Amazon. By the time Jeff stepped back as CEO, Amazon had become almost incomprehensibly large. The company generated nearly $470 billion in revenue in 2020. It employed over 1.3 million people worldwide. Amazon Prime had over 200 million members globally. Amazon's market capitalization exceeded $1.6 trillion. Jeff's personal stake was worth over $180 billion, making him by far the world's richest person. The company he had started with $300,000 from his parents had become one of the most valuable corporations in human history. But the success came with mounting criticism. Amazon faced active antitrust investigations. Labor organizing efforts continued. Congressional leaders called for breaking up Amazon. And worker advocates continued highlighting dangerous conditions. Jeff's legacy, as he stepped back from day-to-day leadership, was deeply complex. He had built an extraordinary company that made life more convenient for hundreds of millions of customers. He had pioneered cloud computing. He had created over 1 million jobs. But he had also built a company so powerful that serious questions existed about whether it was compatible with competitive markets. These tensions would define debates about Amazon for years to come. Now, with the full arc of Jeff's journey, we can finally synthesize what truly made him exceptional. To understand Jeff's real edge, we need to look at 5 interconnected capabilities that compounded over 3 decades. First was Jeff's ability to see mathematical patterns in noise and project them forward with unusual accuracy. This wasn't mystical vision. It was disciplined quantitative analysis combined with willingness to trust models over conventional wisdom. When Jeff saw web usage growing at 2,300% annually, he immediately modeled what that meant over decades. This gave Jeff a form of prophecy. The second source of advantage was structural patience, built through careful stakeholder management. Jeff understood that most companies were trapped by quarterly earnings pressure. Jeff deliberately structured Amazon to escape this trap. From the first shareholder letter in 1997, he set expectations that Amazon would sacrifice short-term profits for long-term market leadership. This created a selection effect over time. Amazon's shareholder base became people who believed in long-term value creation. This structural patience allowed Amazon to make investments that competitors simply couldn't make. The third capability was systems thinking at an unusually deep level. Jeff didn't think about building individual products. He thought about building systems with feedback loops that would improve themselves over time. He actually drew flywheel diagrams showing how different parts of the business reinforced each other. Lower prices attracted more customers. More customers increased volume. Higher volume provided leverage with suppliers. Better wholesale prices enabled lower retail prices. Each turn of the flywheel made the next turn easier. The fourth advantage was network leverage through strategic relationship building. Jeff could identify what each party in a relationship wanted most deeply and structure deals where everyone's incentives aligned. The relationship with third-party marketplace sellers exemplified this. Sellers wanted access to Amazon's customer base. Amazon wanted more selection without carrying inventory. By creating a platform where sellers could reach customers while Amazon took a commission, Jeff aligned all parties' interests. As the platform grew, network effects kicked in. The fifth capability was Jeff's unusual form of conviction and resilience. He could hold strong beliefs through extended periods where reality appeared to contradict those beliefs, yet adjust quickly when data showed he was actually wrong. Jeff's conviction came from rigorous analysis, not ego. When he reached a conclusion after deep study, he believed it with near certainty. But Jeff's conviction wasn't blind. He was constantly monitoring data to see if his models were playing out. When data confirmed his thesis, he doubled down. When data showed he was wrong, he pivoted quickly. These 5 capabilities, pattern recognition, structural patience, systems thinking, network leverage, and resilient conviction, weren't independent. They reinforced each other. Together, these capabilities created something rare in business history. Jeff wasn't just a founder who built a successful company. He built a systematic machine for identifying high-leverage opportunities, designing business models with compounding advantages, and executing with enough patience and conviction to see those advantages realized. In July 2021, when Jeff Bezos stepped down as CEO of Amazon, he left behind a company that had fundamentally transformed commerce, technology infrastructure, and how hundreds of millions of people live. But assessing his true legacy requires looking beyond market capitalization to the broader impacts. For customers, the impact is overwhelmingly positive. Amazon made buying things dramatically easier, faster, and often cheaper. Research suggests Amazon saves consumers tens of billions of dollars annually through lower prices and increased convenience. But the customer benefits came with trade-offs. Amazon's dominance meant customers had less choice about where to shop. Amazon's recommendation algorithms manipulated what people saw. And Amazon's data collection created privacy concerns. For sellers and small businesses, the impact is deeply mixed. Amazon's marketplace created opportunities for millions of small businesses. But those businesses were also dependent on Amazon in ways that created vulnerability. Amazon could change fees or policies at any time. Amazon competed with successful sellers through private label products. The broader impact on retail was even more complex. Amazon created enormous consumer value but also destroyed thousands of retail jobs and businesses. Shopping malls closed. Department stores went bankrupt. Some of this was inevitable creative destruction. But Amazon's combination of low prices and speed accelerated the disruption. For employees, the story is complicated. Software engineers at Amazon were well compensated and worked on challenging problems. But fulfillment center workers faced physically demanding work with intense productivity expectations. For the technology industry, Amazon's impact through AWS was transformative and largely positive. AWS democratized access to sophisticated infrastructure, allowing startups to build products that would have required millions in capital previously. But AWS also created concerns about concentration of infrastructure. Over 30% of the internet runs on AWS. When AWS has outages, large portions of the internet become unavailable. For the environment, Amazon's impact is significant and concerning. The carbon footprint of Amazon's operations is enormous. For society and democracy, the questions are even more profound. Amazon's market power raises legitimate concerns about whether markets remain competitive. Jeff's ownership of the Washington Post adds another dimension. Looking specifically at Jeff's personal legacy, several themes emerge. He was unquestionably one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history. He demonstrated that technical founders could remain effective CEOs at enormous scale. But Jeff's legacy also includes legitimate criticisms. He built a culture of extraordinary intensity that drove innovation but also burnout. Jeff's recent focus on space exploration through Blue Origin adds another layer to his legacy. He argues that space development is humanity's most important long-term challenge, that Earth's resources are finite, and that expanding into space is necessary. Critics argue that Jeff should focus on Earth's problems like climate change and inequality. Jeff's response is that both are important. Whether Jeff succeeds in space as he did in commerce remains to be seen. Blue Origin has not yet achieved the success that SpaceX has. Contemporary relevance of Jeff's story centers on several key lessons. First, the power of long-term thinking when institutionalized properly. Jeff showed that public companies can invest for decades if they manage stakeholder expectations correctly. Second, the importance of systems thinking and compounding advantages. Jeff built flywheels and platforms that became stronger over time. Third, the value of writing and clear thinking. Jeff's insistence on written narrative showed that clear thinking creates better decisions. Fourth, the risks of extreme optimization. Amazon's success came partly from ruthless efficiency, but these same traits created real harms. Fifth, the importance of resilience and conviction. Jeff's ability to stay committed to long-term vision through criticism was essential. For investors, Jeff's story teaches that extraordinary returns come from backing founders with clear long-term visions who are willing to be misunderstood. For society, Jeff's story raises fundamental questions about capitalism and entrepreneurship. Did Jeff create enormous value? Yes. Did he also create concerning concentrations of power? Also yes. The unresolved question is whether we can maintain the innovation that entrepreneurs like Jeff enable while also addressing the concentration of power they create. After examining Jeff's entire journey, we can distill several key lessons. First, timing matters enormously, but in subtle ways. Jeff didn't succeed because he was first to e-commerce. He succeeded because he moved at the exact moment when internet adoption was accelerating but infrastructure hadn't been built yet. The lesson is about recognizing inflection points and moving decisively when conditions align. Second, optionality and platforms beat optimization of specific products. Jeff built infrastructure that could support any product category, creating far more value than optimizing the original bookstore idea. Third, customer obsession requires genuine long-term thinking. Jeff actually sacrificed profits for years to build better customer experiences. Fourth, writing and clear thinking create better decisions. Jeff's insistence on written narratives forced disciplined thinking. Fifth, hire for intelligence and willingness to learn over domain expertise. Jeff valued raw intellectual horsepower because smart people can learn domains but domain experts struggle to think differently. Sixth, marginal thinking beats average thinking. Jeff focused on marginal costs and investments rather than average metrics. Seventh, distribution and logistics matter as much as product. Jeff invested billions in fulfillment networks, treating logistics as core competency. Eighth, financial structure enables strategic flexibility. By maintaining access to cheap capital, Jeff could invest through downturns when competitors couldn't. Ninth, systems and culture scale better than heroic individual effort. Jeff built mechanisms that made good decisions at scale. 10th, metrics must be chosen carefully because you get what you measure. Jeff focused on cash flow and customer lifetime value rather than immediate profit. Beyond business lessons, Jeff's life offers insights about ambition and sacrifice. He achieved extraordinary business success, but his marriage failed. He built a company that employed millions but faced criticism about working conditions. He became the richest person in history but also one of the most criticized billionaires. Success at this scale requires trade-offs that shouldn't be romanticized. Jeff also demonstrates both the power and danger of conviction. His ability to maintain long-term vision was essential. But conviction can also blind you to legitimate concerns. The story of Jeff Bezos is ultimately a story about seeing what others don't see and having the conviction to act on that vision. From his childhood summers learning that any problem could be solved, to his Wall Street training in pattern recognition, to his decision to bet everything on the internet, to his 3 decades building Amazon through multiple near-death experiences, Jeff demonstrated a rare combination of analytical rigor and bold action. He saw that the internet would transform commerce. He saw that customer obsession could beat quarterly optimization. He saw that platforms would create network effects. He saw that cloud computing would transform infrastructure. But seeing and conviction aren't enough. Jeff also executed with discipline and intensity that few could match. He built systems and culture that scaled. He attracted exceptional talent. He made thousands of decisions that compounded into competitive advantages. He evolved from startup founder to CEO of one of the world's largest companies. The result is a company that fundamentally changed how hundreds of millions of people live. The impact on commerce is staggering. On technology infrastructure, it may be even larger. The wealth created is enormous. But the story also includes real costs. Workers who felt exploited. Small businesses that couldn't compete. Communities where retail jobs disappeared. Concentration of power that may threaten competition. Environmental impacts. Questions about whether any individual should accumulate such wealth. Jeff's response to these tensions has evolved. Early on, he seemed to believe that optimizing for customers was sufficient responsibility. But as Amazon grew larger, he seemed to recognize that scale creates obligations. Whether his later efforts are sufficient is debatable. What seems clear is that Jeff's legacy will be debated for decades. He was unquestionably one of the most successful entrepreneurs in history. Whether he was also a positive force for society depends on how you weigh the benefits against the costs. For entrepreneurs, Jeff's story offers a powerful model of what's possible with clear vision, disciplined execution, and long-term thinking. For society, Jeff's story raises profound questions about capitalism and concentration of power. We want the innovation that entrepreneurs like Jeff enable. But we also need to grapple with the concentrations of power they create. For Jeff himself, the journey continues. At 57, when he stepped back from Amazon's CEO role, he's focused on space exploration, climate initiatives, and other long-term projects. Whether he can replicate his Amazon success in these new domains remains to be seen. Space is harder than e-commerce. Climate change is more complex than building a retail platform. But betting against Jeff's ability to think long-term would have been a mistake at many points in the past. In the end, Jeff Bezos' story is about the power of long-term thinking in a short-term world, the importance of conviction in the face of doubt, and the extraordinary results possible when analytical rigor combines with bold action. He saw the future more clearly than almost anyone, built systems to realize that vision, and stayed committed long enough to see those systems transform the world. Whether that transformation was entirely positive remains an open question. But the magnitude of the impact is undeniable. The story of Jeff Bezos and Amazon will be studied for generations as an example of entrepreneurship at the highest level, of the possibilities and perils of platform businesses, and of one person's ability to shape how billions of people live their lives. It's a story of extraordinary success built on specific capabilities applied consistently over decades. It's also a story that raises uncomfortable questions about power and responsibility. Both perspectives are true, and both are essential to understanding what Jeff accomplished and what it means for the rest of us.